Welcome to Understanding Islam, episode 11. This is the third series. We're looking at building a just society. And today our topic is martyrdom and suicide and self-sacrifice. So let's begin the discussion by asking the question, whose life is it anyway? Who is responsible for the fact that I'm alive? Well, hardly me, and hardly even my parents, because no human beings can command another life into existence. So in Islamic understanding, our lives are a gift from God. They belong to God. We are not our own property, we are the property of God. And so the whole nature of human life is a gesture of submission to the will of God. It is obedience and acknowledging, I belong to God, I am the property of God. Therefore, it's not for me to decide when it should be that I should die. So the Quran is explicit in forbidding me to commit suicide. Suicide is an illegal and immoral act, according to Islam. It's directly forbidden. So all human beings come from God, all human beings are going to God. And God alone knows the hour when any human being should die. So when we're talking about martyrdom, this isn't something in which I decide I will be a martyr. Rather, it's always a question of submission to the divine will. If God so wills that I should be a martyr, then so be it. God will find in me an obedient servant. So it's never a matter of my choice, it's always a matter of invitation and response. We can see this when we look at the Quranic story of Abraham and Ishmael. Because Abraham is commanded by God to sacrifice his son. And then he goes to Ishmael and says, Ishmael, this is what God has commanded me to do. What do you say about it? And Ishmael replies, you will find in me an obedient one, a patient one. So he is obedient to the will of God. My life belongs to God. If it should please God that I should die now, so be it. This idea of martyrdom, which is, if you like, a public witness to our obedience, to our submission to God, to our refusal to give way to anything other than God, is not just confined to Islam. It's there in many different religious traditions. We see it also in Judaism. Let's just take two examples. In the 2nd century before the time of Jesus, the Jews were under Roman occupation, and the Romans were trying to force them to commit acts of idolatry. They had turned the Jewish temple into a temple of idolatry, and they were trying to force people to offer sacrifices to the idols. And there was a revolt led by the family of the Maccabees, who preferred to die as martyrs, to be brutally killed by the Romans, rather than to defile the temple of God, to go against the direct teaching of God that you should worship God alone. Death was preferable to this kind of disobedience, to this kind of false witness. And one of them, I remember especially, the story tells us that he says, I am a man of advanced years. For the sake of a few years more, I should perform this act and set a bad example to all the young people who should follow. So always we see the idea of martyrdom being associated with witness and good example. In another episode in Jewish history, and now we're talking about around 70 years after the time of Jesus, there was again a Roman army that came to Jerusalem, that destroyed the temple and was driving the Jews from that place. And a group of zealots, people who were very strong and firm in the piety of their faith, took a last stand on a mountain rock called Masada. There they were being surrounded, laid siege by the Romans, and they preferred to die at their own hands rather than to be forced by the Romans to perform idolatrous acts. In the Christian tradition as well, in the early centuries after Jesus, there were persecution of Christians by the Roman authorities. They did not want them to be following this foreign religion, as they said. Instead, they wanted them to observe the cult of the divine emperor and to offer sacrifices to the emperor. And they were threatening them with dreadful suffering, being thrown to lions, being burnt, being torn apart, and so on, if they refused to worship the emperor. And they preferred death in this way to going to a false act, an act of false witness by worshipping the Roman emperor instead of worshipping God alone. So we can see this business of martyrdom, which is running through different religious traditions. We see it in Chinese tradition, in Japanese tradition as well, with the martyrs who were warriors. And to be a warrior, to be prepared to fight in the way of your religious tradition, was also an important part in these cultures, just as it was at times in Christianity too, when we see the military orders there who were prepared to fight to defend the holy places, for example. We can even see this kind of determination to set an example by good witness instead of bad in the instance of hunger strikers in the world today. When we look at the Arabic term shaheed in the Quran, we see that there are three levels of meaning there. One is simply as a witness to a contract, a witness in court. In one place we're told that God is the witness. God is the witness of everything that happens within creation. And then there is another use of the term in which it takes on more this dual meaning of witness and martyr. So that is bearing witness to the truth, to faith, through one's life, surrendering one's life to God. And there are different places in the Quran that speak about someone who loses their life for the sake of God or in the way of God. We're told that they are not dead, but they are alive, that their sins are forgiven, that they will be rewarded for this action, and that they will go to paradise. So these verses are there in the Quran, and then that is developed in the Islamic tradition, augmented by hadith and so on, so that we begin to see that the martyr is one who is accorded these honors by God, that they do not experience life in the grave or barzakh, but rather they go to paradise straight away with God, and therefore they are alive and they are not dead. And then at the resurrection, their souls are reunited with their bodies, and in their bodily form then they will enter into paradise along with everyone else, where they will receive the crown of glory and they will have a place of great honor within paradise, where they will be awaited, attended by sexual companions, and where they will be given by God the invitation to intercede for other people, especially to intercede for members of their family. So we begin to get the link between being a martyr and, by God's grace, being invited to intercede for others. The Islamic tradition divides martyrs into two groups. They're called martyrs in this world and the next, and martyrs in the next world only. So let's look at the first group first of all. Now, different schools of Islam will define these things slightly differently, so we're just going to take a general broad picture today. Who then are those who are martyrs in this world and the next? Generally, these are seen to be battlefield martyrs, those who lose their lives on the field of battle, generally when they are fighting against injustice, against unbelievers, against tyranny. So to lose one's life on the field of battle is the key criteria. Such battlefield martyrs, let's call them, are accorded certain special privileges after the time of their death. Three things do not take place. First of all, the body is not washed. Now, this is the normal practice before somebody is prepared for burial, and it is partly to do as a sign of washing away impurities from the body of the deceased person. But of course, the martyr is someone who's had all their sins washed away by their martyrdom, by losing their life in this way. Therefore, there is no question of any impurity or sin clinging to them, and so they are not washed in preparation for burial. Secondly, they are not shrouded, but rather they are buried in the clothes that they were wearing when they lost their lives. Traditionally, this was called blood-stained clothing. And indeed, on the day of resurrection, when they will be reunited with their bodies, this was held to be a kind of badge of honor, that they would be recognized as martyrs on the day of resurrection. And then there's the question of whether or not one should pray over the martyr at the burial. And here the schools of Islam vary. Some will say, no, you shouldn't, for two reasons. First of all, this martyr is not dead, but is alive. And secondly, that prayers over the dead body are to do with asking for God's mercy and forgiveness for this person. Well, they're not in need of God's mercy and forgiveness because all their sins have been washed away by the shedding of their blood. And then others will say, oh yes, there should be prayers over the dead martyr at their burial, because every human being stands in need of the mercy and forgiveness of God. It's not unusual in the Islamic history to find mothers who are presented with sometimes, the body of their dead martyr son, perhaps daughter, and who command that there should be no mourning, but there should only be gratitude, because God has invited their beloved child to this highest, this greatest honor of being a martyr, being one who endured unto death and gave their life in the way of God. So we can see that this is a very high dignity within the Islamic tradition. The second group, those who are martyrs in the next world only, are those who in various ways in their life, not necessarily through battle, submit their lives so totally in obedience to God that their life is forfeit in the process. Now, this group of martyrs are not accorded any special burial rites. They are washed and shrouded and prayed over in the same way as all other people. There's a much wider group of people who are included under this heading of martyrs in the next world only. They include people who die of their wounds in fighting and those who are worn out by fighting. But they include also those who die rather than renounce their faith. So the first martyr that we have in the Muslim tradition is a woman in the early years of Mecca called Sumayya, and she was killed by her family because she had converted to Islam, and obviously they didn't like that. So she was the first one to die for her faith. But also people can become martyrs in this way through losing their life fighting off criminals, for example, or who were murdered when they're going about the business of God. So they lose their life in the way of God. But also people who die during times of plague, mothers who die during childbirth, and then travelers, those who die when they are on their way to make the pilgrimage of the Hajj, those who die when they journey in search of knowledge. These also are accorded the title of martyr here. And amongst the Sufis, they will use this title for someone who has completely destroyed the lower inclinations so that they have elevated and raised their spirit to be in a state of communion with God. So we see a much wider grouping under martyrs of the next world only. There are certain people within the Islamic tradition who stand out as exemplary martyrs. Hamza, for example, the uncle of the Prophet, who was killed in the Battle of Uhud, and then Hind comes and cuts out and eats his liver. He is regarded as being one of the ideal or one of the exemplary martyrs. Imam Hussein, the grandson of the Prophet, who dies with his companions in 680 on the field of Karbala. In fact, in the Shia tradition, all of the first 11 Imams, all met a martyr's death. So we can see that this ideal runs through Islamic history. And now we need to face the question about a suicide martyr. Can those two terms go together? Well, let's ask first of all about the causality of the death of the martyr. You see, the martyr is someone who takes a stand in the way of God, who takes a stand for justice, for truth, for faith, for obedience to God's command, and will not move and will not give way to tyranny, no matter what the other person does. And so they are killed by the other person because of their stand for truth. So the causality of their death is very clear. Someone else kills them because of their stand in the way of God. Now, if we compare that with suicide, a suicide is someone who kills themselves. So they take to themselves, they usurp, we can say, that right of God to determine when their life should end. Suicide, as we know, is forbidden explicitly in the Quran. When we think about a suicide bomber, such a person is not only killing themselves, but they are also doing it in such a way as to bring about terror, suffering, death, destruction to other people. This is indiscriminate killing. This also is forbidden by the Islamic rules of engagement. Some Muslim scholars have gone so far as to say that someone who takes their own life in this way, with this intention, dies in a state of ultimate rebellion before God, because they deliberately take their own life without giving themselves one moment in which they could repent. It's interesting to notice that out of all the figures out of the Hebrew Bible who are mentioned in the Quran and in the Islamic tradition, one person who isn't mentioned is Samson. Now, Samson is a figure in the Hebrew Bible, one of the judges or the leaders of the people, who actually brings about the death of his enemies by bringing about his own death too. He is taken to the temple of the idol worshippers, and he is a man of great strength and pushes down the pillars that support the temple, kills his enemies, and kills himself too. This person is never mentioned in the Quran or in the Islamic tradition. Now, this understanding then of a suicide bomber as opposed to a martyr has meant that within the worldwide Muslim community in 2004, a major declaration was signed called the Amman Message that made it very clear that such actions are not part of the Islamic tradition. They are outside the way of Islam because they are going against the will of God, the command of God, the guidance of the Quran. Nowhere within the Quran or in the time of the Prophet do we hear of him sending out a suicide mission. Now we need to ask another question. What is the difference between a suicide and an act of self-sacrifice? Now, this not only depends on the external nature of the act, but also it depends on the inner intention, the niyyah of the individual. Now, God alone can judge the inner intention of the individual, but we can see that this is much more complex than it at first appears. Take the case, for example, of a mother with her children, and they are attacked, they come under fire, and she puts herself into the line of fire and is killed in order to save her children. Or a grenade is thrown, and she dives over the grenade to absorb the blast with her own body to save the life of her children. Well, would we call this suicide, or would we call this an act of self-sacrifice? If we take another example, we can think of an injured soldier who says to his comrades, "Leave me here. You'll never get away if you have to take me with you. You try and escape. I will give you covering fire for as long as I am able before they get me." Well, we know, he knows, that he is going to be killed in that process. Is that an act of noble sacrifice, or is that an act of suicide? Or if we think in our own time, a nuclear reactor dysfunctions, goes into meltdown or whatever, somebody volunteers to go in and to try to switch it off, to try to repair the damage in some way in order to save a major catastrophe. It is death to go in that way. But is that an act of suicide, or is that an act of a very different quality? We can think of someone who tackles a suicide bomber, for example. We had a recent case in Pakistan, somebody who tackles them and dies in the process. Well, is that an act of noble self-sacrifice? It is only in the last period of time, with the development of what we're calling the Al-Qaeda tendency, this group of people who have actually turned a suicide attack into a preferred weapon. This is the exception, this is the extreme position which is not supported by mainstream Islam. Join me again next week when we'll be looking in the final part of this series at inviting people to the way of Islam. And don't forget that you can download the article that goes with each of these programs from my own website. I look forward to seeing you then.